Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for being here. And I was complimenting our Manhattan Borough President, Gale Brewer, of how she could get a crowd together like this on such short notice for such an important topic that we all need to hear about. And I must confess, I'm Carol Mason, the new president of John Jay College of Criminal Justice, and I'm here to just welcome you all to this informative teach-in on something that I was hoping for a miracle would not happen today. So I am so glad that Gale Brewer and Scott Stringer were prepared for this and that they're going to help us figure out how to navigate this. So please join me in welcoming our Manhattan Borough President, Gale Brewer.
Thank you very much, President Mason, and I want to thank you for your incredible team, particularly Mindy Bockstein, for providing the space during the last week of classes. And John Jay is always a wonderful institution to the community, and it's great to have a full house. It's the most sweeping tax code change since the 1980s, and instead of Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, we could call it the Tax Accountants Full Employment Act.
That is true.
I remember many elected officials in Washington who decried the Affordable Care Act's revamping of 1/12 the nation's economy and used that as a reason to oppose ACA. But now many of those same people are giddy at changing the entire tax structure of our nation. It's an extraordinary piece of legislation, not just because it was passed so quickly with notes in the margin, and I've never seen anything like that, no public hearings, permanent tax cut for businesses, and temporary cuts for everyone else, but we'll learn a lot more tonight. The so-called reforms in this bill will have profound impacts on New York City, and that's why we're all here, because we love our city. The cap on state and local tax deductibility alone will change the economics for hundreds of families. Specific changes will affect individual households, but the aggregate of those individual changes will affect our city as a whole. And that's why we're here to learn tonight. I want to thank Manhattan Neighborhood Network, that is the television station for our wonderful borough, and they were recording tonight's session, and the first broadcast, although it will run often, is Friday, December 22nd at 8 p.m. on their cable channels, and MNN is also very accessible on the web. You can find also on our website, which is just manhattanbp.nyc.gov. So without further ado, I would like to introduce my colleague. He's also the former borough president. He thinks that I had big shoes to fill. But I want to introduce the very special Scott Stringer, Comptroller, and I want to thank him for having Preston Neblack, although the fact of the matter is I asked Preston and then I asked Scott. May I introduce Scott Stringer, our wonderful Comptroller.
Well, good evening, everybody. And I want to start out by acknowledging the great president of John Jay College, and that's Carol Mason. Give her another round of applause. And I also want to thank everyone for coming out tonight, especially during the holiday season. But I particularly want to thank Gale Brewer, who smartly understood that the law Republicans just passed is an unprecedented tax war on the middle class and low income Americans. And that the most important thing right now is to understand the law's impact. Because there is no doubt that we will be demonstrating and protesting and organizing, but right now we have got to absorb and understand so that we can articulate not just a critique, but a different vision for America and for our city. Before we fight back, we need to be armed with the knowledge. And we have a very distinguished panel tonight. They'll explain the implications of the new tax law. But make no mistake, millions of everyday New Yorkers are going to end up hurt as a consequence of this legislation. And that's exactly the point of this. This law is designed as a Christmas present to corporations that are already making record profits. Under this legislation, the top 1% would average tax cuts well above $100,000, and wage earners will be penalized. States that voted for Donald Trump will do much better than those that voted against him, like New York. Now, that's not an accident. This law turns the tax code into a weapon that will benefit Trump donors and supporters and punish the rest of us. If Republicans wanted to pass a middle class tax cut, they could have. They had the votes. If they wanted to invest in Social Security, health care, they could have done it. Instead, they have created a great stocking stuffer for people who inherit estates and develop real estate. Worst of all, this tax scam will lead to a huge budget deficit, which Republicans will then use to justify cuts in health care and the social safety net. Whatever small tax cuts middle and low-income New Yorkers will get from the law will be dwarfed by their loss of health insurance and the coming cuts in social services. It's tempting to call this plan a bait and switch, but let's face it, they did it out in the open. They told us exactly what they were going to do. They were not shy about this. They want to dismantle urban America and large parts of this country. After tonight, you're going to have a lot of knowledge so that we can articulate a different vision. As Comptroller, we watch the numbers, we crunch the numbers, we watch the books. And much of the work that we've done looking at this tax cut has been driven by Preston Niblack, our Deputy Comptroller for Budget, and I want to thank him for doing this, but then he can't ever tell Gale no, right? So Gale just calls him and says, I'm going to this panel.
It's so much easier if you don't.
Yes, I'm here too. But let's just say this, we do have challenges, but I do believe that the knowledge that we will get tonight will give us the impetus to tell others and build a different kind of movement. And it really starts with the teaching. And I do want to thank Gale. I want to thank all of you for coming out. You know, when the West Side gets the call, we always answer the call. We never stay at home, and we never don't participate. And that's exactly what we're doing tonight. So thank you, Gale. Thank you, distinguished panelists. And let's keep organizing. Don't agonize, organize. This fight's just beginning. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Scott Stringer, Comptroller. And now I am very honored that our Public Advocate, Tish James, has joined us. We served together in the City Council. She's fabulous, but we can also finish each of their sentences. I give you Tish James.
It's an honor and a privilege to be here. As you all know, I admire and I greatly respect your borough president. She's been a friend of mine, and I often refer to her as the modern-day Eleanor Roosevelt. She puts her head down, she gets to work, and she doesn't get involved in petty politics, and that's why we love her all throughout the city. And she truly deserves the honor and the title of being the hardest working woman in politics. A round of applause to your borough president. And to, of course, our Comptroller, Scott Stringer, and of course to this wonderful panel who I've had the honor and distinction of working with in my various functions and jobs throughout my career in state government and here in the city of New York as a city council member and now as the public advocate of the city of New York, and during my days as an attorney as well. So, early this morning, the United States Congress overhauled our tax system, the most dramatic change in 30 years. The final language that was voted on is over 1,000 pages long. 1,000 pages, and was only publicly released on Monday. How many of you attended any of the hearings? I thought so. The bill is long, it's complicated, and many members of Congress have publicly admitted to not having read the full language. And the entire process of creating this legislation has been undemocratic. And it was done in secrecy with high-paid lobbyists, seeing drafts of bills before members of Congress. And when a bill is drafted by a special interest, it is no surprise that it only benefits those who can pay for special interest. And instead, it is bad for the middle class, bad for working people, bad for New Yorkers, bad for low-income individuals, bad for urban America, bad for states that are blue, deep blue. And Republicans are promoting this as a quote-unquote reform bill, which will be good for every American and cut taxes across the board. And the truth is, according to experts, high-income individuals will get more than 60% of the benefits of this bill. They describe this bill as basically a trickle-down economics, but we all know historically that trickle-down economics has never worked. And so let's get right down to how this is going to hurt New Yorkers, how this is going to hurt each and every one of us in this room. This bill will hurt New Yorkers across the board, both high and low income earners, both entrepreneurs and union workers, both homeowners and renters, and both rich and poor and everyone in between. You've probably heard a lot of talk about SALT, state and local taxes. Right now, taxpayers are able to write off the cost of state and local taxes, especially meaning you don't have to pay twice, basically meaning you don't have to pay twice. Under the proposed new law, you will only be able to write off up to around $10,000. Living in a high tax state like New York, obviously we will be penalized. The possible consequences to New York under this change are alarming. It would decrease property values and would stifle our economy. The proposed new law will also make formerly tax-deductible work expenses no longer tax-deductible, including union dues and expenses. This is a provision of the bill that has not been discussed, and it's buried under many of the other provisions, but will have an adverse impact on New York City. Why do you say? Because New York City is a union town, and we are a proud union town that supports our union workers, and this is nothing more than another tactic to punish labor and the union movement all across this country, because they believe in a right to work state, which really isn't a right to work at all. It's a rush to the bottom. And finally, Republicans who failed time and time again to repeal the legacy of President Obama are using this bill to eliminate the individual health care mandate, incentivizing healthy Americans to having insurance by charging a tax if they opt out, and it brings down the cost for all Americans. Repealing this mandate is a sideways attempt to peel apart Obamacare one piece at a time. And so this bill will literally kill people. There's no question about it. And these are just three of the major options that will negatively affect New Yorkers in this behemoth of a bill that will overhaul our economy and really represents the only accomplishment of this administration, if you call this an accomplishment. I call it a stab in the back to all Americans. But we cannot despair. We cannot give up hope. Because in the past 2 weeks, I try to focus on hope. I just remember the days, the night, when I was jumping up in my bed after Virginia, after New Jersey, and yes, after Alabama. So we must harness our energy and our anger into action and look towards 2018. And I know I'm not supposed to discuss politics in an event which is sponsored by government, but I'm from Brooklyn, so. We have a chance to reverse those policies by putting elected officials in office to act responsibly when it comes to our economy and our livelihood. And we can basically, in 2018, hopefully contain this madman who now inhabits the White House, because he's conned his way into the White House. And this represents the biggest scam, the biggest con, and the biggest scheme that has ever been imposed upon the American people. And that's why I've come here this evening, and that's why I will go wherever I can to speak about the resistance and to speak about the power of the American people to stand back against this tyranny. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Tish James, and I want to thank our panel. I'm going to start introducing them with Preston Nieblack, who, as you heard, is Deputy Comptroller for Budget, responsible for overseeing the work of the Budget Bureau in the Comptroller's Office and monitoring our fiscal and cash position in the city, and he has worked as Director of the Finance Division at the New York City Council, and he was Deputy Director of the New York City Independent Budget Office. Thank you very much, Preston, for being here. Kathy Wild is President and CEO of the Partnership for New York. It is the city's leading business organization. She works with government and labor and the civic sector to build a stronger New York with a focus on education, infrastructure, and the economy. Thank you very much. Martha Stark is a clinical professor at New York University's Wagner School of Public Service. She served as commissioner of the New York City Department of Finance for many years, and she collected the taxes. She was a White House fellow in the Clinton administration. Mark Willis is a housing expert and senior policy fellow at NYU Furman Center He has worked in community development at J.P. Morgan Chase and the City Department of Housing Preservation and Development. James Parrott is Director of Economic and Fiscal Policies at the Center for New York City Affairs at the New School. He was also a fiscal policy expert, fiscal policy, and he has a long history working with the labor community. Finally, and more specifically, we're really honored that Greg David is our moderator. He is Director of the Business Reporting Program at CUNY's Graduate School of Journalism. He's a columnist at Crain's New York, a publication that I love and read regularly, and he has followed this topic closely. Greg, I'll turn it over to you, and thank you all for being here tonight.
I have a question for you all. How many of you think your taxes will go up because of this bill? You're all wrong. Every New York City single person making less than $500,000 will see a tax cut for the foreseeable future. And for couples making less than $1 million, they will see a tax cut. And these tax cuts are not in the hundreds, but approximate in the low thousands of dollars. So I think that's why, in a way, we're here, right? Because so much of the political rhetoric about this bill has actually left the common sense. It isn't about what will actually happen. If you listen to people about all this stuff about the middle class, it happens in the next decade, when the tax cuts for individuals expire. But in the meantime, everybody in this room is going to pay less taxes. So I want to begin with the panel, and I've got two tasks for them. So the first task is I want an adjective to describe this tax bill. Not so bad, for New York City. Not so bad, neutral, a little bit bad, or very bad. Preston, you get to go first, and then we're going to go down the panel.
Very bad.
Very bad.
A little bit bad.
Mark?
I'll agree with that. A little bit bad.
Jim?
Historically horrendous. I was never good at multiple choice.
Kathy?
A little bit bad.
All right, Kathy, I'll start with you. Give me one bad thing about the bill and one good thing about the bill.
Well, the good thing about the bill is it supports, it reduces the corporate tax rate and creates a more competitive corporate tax situation so that companies will be able to hopefully expand, build our economy, create more jobs. That's the good thing. The bad thing is that that individual taxpayers are paying for that. It's not middle-class taxpayers, as Greg pointed out. It's high-income taxpayers.
And I'm going to come back to you on that. Jim?
There's not anything good about this.
Okay, I want short answers here. Nothing good. You say. What's the worst thing? What's the worst thing?
The worst thing in my mind is that it will be followed by part two, which is budget cuts on a scale that we have never seen before.
Okay,
and
that's
will be
good enough.
very
That's good enough
harmful to New York.
That's good enough for now. Everybody has to understand this. There are no budget cuts in this bill. There is nothing that happens tomorrow because of this bill. But the question is, as the deficit rise, the question is, if the tax cuts do not create economic growth that produces more tax revenue, the deficit will grow. And then it is presumed that there will be budget cuts. Although the politics of those budget cuts are very difficult. Mark, good and bad.
So the good thing is, the good thing here is that we avoided a near-death experience in the affordable housing area. That they were originally going to get rid of what's called private activity bonds. They account for a huge percentage of the affordable housing that we're building in the city, and so would greatly jeopardize the
And
mayor's
bad things? Bad? A bad thing? A bad thing.
I think the bad thing is the loss of state and local deductions. So the SALT. I'm sorry. The bad thing was the loss of state and local deduction for state and local.
How many of you, does anybody have a guess how many New York City residents itemize in the current tax issue? How many think it's more than 50%? Nobody. What percentage of New York City taxpayers actually itemize their deductions? Because if you don't itemize, this whole discussion of salt's irrelevant to you.
No, not
How many? It's a question. I get to ask the questions for now. You get to ask the questions later. How many people think more than half of New York City taxpayers itemize? Only a few. Only a third. Only a third. Salt only affects a third of New York City taxpayers. How do we know? There's been enormous research on this. There are all kinds of reports. The state controller has an enormously detailed report on all this. What we're going to tell you, unlike what you heard to begin, what we're going to tell you on this panel is factual, not political. Martha, best and worst.
So I think the best part is that the standard deduction has been increased along with the child care credit, that's gone up, in some instances almost doubled. And I think one more good thing, sorry, I know I'm only supposed to do one.
No, we're only doing one now.
I'm
We're
gonna
only
cheat.
doing one.
You can give it to me.
Everybody is talking about taxes, and as a former tax administrator, that never happens. So it's really great to have that.
That's
Okay,
minor.
sorry.
One bad thing. one
Yes.
bad
Okay.
thing.
So I think the probably the followed by part two. I'm gonna sort of ditto what Jim said.
Okay. Preston?
So I think the best thing that can be said about this bill is that it could have been worse compared to the House and Senate versions.
That's
And
actually
it-
very factually true.
And I think it's hard to choose what the worst thing is, but I will just randomly pick. I think the thing that's most revolutionary about this is how differently it treats different incomes. So people have the same income, but from different sources will now be taxed at different rates, and that really violates a kind of fundamental principle of tax equity.
Yes, it's actually it's a war on rich people who make their money in salaries. Those people are likely to be greatly disadvantaged by this bill to benefit businesses, and especially smaller businesses or professions that are allowed to pass through their income. Kathy, you're going to have to leave early, so I'm going to do a couple early questions for you. One of the things is that one of the crucial issues that's come up is the fact that New York City's wealthier people are going to pay substantially more, and the partnership has done a lot of work on this subject. You just came out with a very detailed chart of who pays more in federal income tax, who pays less, and how that compares to a no income tax state like Florida. So why don't you give us a short summary of what it shows, and especially I would like to hear your views on how much this might matter.
Well, what it shows is that New York is disadvantaged compared to other states. So it's not so much that people here, most people's income tax will not go up, but most people in lower tax states, their taxes will go down substantially. So, or average of $900 per taxpayer across the country, which doesn't sound substantial, but when you look at it, it gives them a competitive advantage against New York. So we're trying to compete for talent from around the world to bring here. And as a result, either we have to raise salaries in New York to compensate for the higher taxes compared to other places, or we will lose the opportunity to bring people here, great professors, great scientists, build our life science industry, top executives, top finance professionals, because there is a real substantial difference between coming here, going to London, going to Florida, going to Texas. Almost any place in the world, our taxes will be higher, except for California and New Jersey. So that's the problem that we really face here. And it's a serious one for the future of our economy.
Preston, I was reading the Comptroller's economic forecast before I came, and in it, the forecast suggests that the fact that the people in this room are going to have more money next year in their pockets is actually going to be good for the New York City economy. Tell us about that, and tell us about how much of a difference you think that will make.
Well, the forecast that we just put out actually does not take into account the tax bill. It was sort of a baseline
You have
tax
this nice
neutral.
little summary in the beginning.
Right. But basically it's a tax neutral sort of current law baseline because we couldn't quite wrap our heads around, which bill we should forecast on the basis of. The New York City economy is doing reasonably well right now in terms of employment and job growth
More than
and earnings.
reasonably well. It's the best economy
Yeah.
I have seen in 30 years covering the city.
So it's we're slowing a little bit, but it's a very strong economy. We've created more jobs in the last decade than and I don't know how long before that. I do agree with Kathy that the way the tax bill is structured means that we're going to be disadvantaged in terms of the higher income taxpayers, and that's a problem for our long-term competitiveness and for our long-term growth. That's something that we will tackle in our next forecast.
Martha, do you think this forecast has this bill has any direct impact on the city's budget, or how do you think it might affect the city's budget?
I definitely think it's not the current law. I mean, it's soon to be law, right? Signed in, doesn't have a immediate sort of impact, but I do think that it raises for the city questions about where, if they need to raise taxes, they're going to raise them from. And as you know,
Who's the they we're talking
the
about?
city, the city,
And the state?
and the state. And as you know, the property tax is my sort of favorite tax. Where to say that. There are built-in inequities already in the property tax, and I think that those inequities are exacerbated by the limit on state and local tax deduction, and that's problematic.
Mark, you're the housing expert on the panel. You already told us that the affordable housing program, especially by the de Blasio administration, was saved from disaster. But are there other provisions in this bill that could affect affordable housing? And for many people, there was a lot of talk earlier that the combination of the property tax cap and limits on mortgage deductions could affect the higher priced real estate markets, especially in Manhattan and the suburbs. So would you tell us where you think we ended up?
So, Greg, you raised both of the key points. So, in affordable housing, it looked like it was going to be a disaster, as I said, near death, and it's not so bad. So, a big part of the city's affordable housing program depends on the low-income housing tax credits. The decrease in the marginal tax rate makes them less valuable. So the credits, the way it works in a sentence is the credits are sold to investors, and so the credits are worth less to investors than they would. So the city will have to come up with more money out of its own pocket in order to meet the goals that it had in mind.
And we're already what, north of $12 billion in the capital budget for the mayor's affordable housing plan?
No, that's correct. That's correct. The other piece that you're talking about, and we can go into more detail on that. There are other things that affect investors, something called BEAT, and some very esoteric things, and we don't fully know all the impact of that. The other piece, though, that you were talking about is there are forecasts that the price of housing will fall here, and that can have serious short-term implications here, and maybe actually beneficial long-term implications. So in the short term, people since the mortgage interest deduction is capped at $750,000, it may be that people be willing to pay less for housing, and their property taxes can't deduct them beyond the $10,000. So if housing prices fall, then that may slow the development market. We're already seeing, I think, a readjustment in the condo market today, and so in the long run, this kind of favors rental properties, and developers may do get more of a mix of rental property than home ownership. But in the meantime, the market may stall a little bit because people don't like to pay less for homes and have the house fall in value, and landowners don't like to sell their land for less. So we may see a short-term adjustment period.
Why do you think this might be a long-term good thing?
Well, I think the mix, I guess I shouldn't have said good or bad. I think the mix between home ownership and rental the attractiveness for developers, rental will become more relatively attractive, where a few years ago, everybody wanted to build condos, particularly in Manhattan.
Jim, I believe you're You're very concerned about the impact of the tax bill on nonprofits. Would you tell us about that?
Well, so, again, while there are no budget cuts per se in the tax bill, it's very clear for those of us who listen closely to what the White House says and what the Republican leadership in Congress says, that they fully intend to proceed full steam right away, as soon as they come back in January, with draconian budget cuts. You know, they're not going to wait to see the deficit rise because of the tax cuts. They're going to start in right away. And the most hypocritical action that, you know, anybody can remember, that will affect everybody in New York City and New York State, as well as a lot of Trump voters around the country. Number one on the hit list is the SNAP program, the food stamps program. A lot of low-income whites in rural areas and Trump voting states rely on food stamps, so that's going to get cut. So that's going to hit children and low-income families, as well as, you know, if they proceed to actually cut the budget to the extent that they're talking about, in the October budget resolution that Congress voted, which gave the Senate the authority to pass a tax bill with only under reconciliation rules, so they only needed 51 votes. They committed to cut the budget by $5.8 trillion over the next decade. That's almost everything besides military in the non-discretionary budget. So in the discretionary budget in Washington. So that's going to affect nonprofits along with all low-income residents and children in the city and the state.
Kathy, since I'm someone who's regarded as someone who knows about business in New York, I've had a lot of people, including at least one person on this panel, write me and say, why couldn't the New York City business community stop the end of the SALT deduction? What were they doing? And after all, when this came up in '86, the business community was instrumental in preventing the Reagan tax bill from ending state and local tax deductions. What's different today?
Well, there were Democrats in charge, is the difference. This is a political bill. This was a hit at the Democratic states. It was pure politics. The only shot we had, and we went to the White House in April to try and make the case with the leadership of the business community, the only shot we had was if the Trump administration would have opposed the loss of state and local deductibility, which is the biggest problem for New York City and state in this bill. And they chose not to. They chose to pay for the tax cuts with $1.5 trillion hit on the 10 states that represent 50% of our national economy that are the high deduction states. That was a decision that was made by the administration. The Congress, the Republican leadership in both the House and the Senate, it was already in the bag that this was going to be the way they punished the Democratic states. So it was pure politics. There was nothing you could do about it.
I believe you all have cards to write questions on, so if you want to write questions, I would urge you to do it. And in a few minutes, people will come around to collect them, and I get to decide whether they get asked or not. Kathy, I want to stay with you for a second, because I think the crucial issue here, given that federal taxes on New York, on rich New Yorkers are going up, given that the gap between what they're going to pay here and in a no-income tax state like Florida is going to grow, and of course that gap already exists because state and local taxes in New York, I looked it up, New York is #1 in the state and local tax burden in the country, Florida's 34th, Texas is 48th.
And importantly, London is international. Think globally, because the people we're talking about go globally. We're the highest globally.
Will people move? Will this result in people deciding to relocate?
You know, there have been different analysis. It's less a problem of people moving, because actually those people that were going to move have probably already are spending 183 days elsewhere. So I think it's less a problem than people moving than of attracting people here and the relative cost to employers. Because most of the employers in the city, when they were analyzing what are the benefits of the reduction in taxes on corporations, they were then looking at, but what's it going to cost us in additional compensation to our employees? And so the problem is, will they invest in attracting the people and bringing them here? Will they let them go to London or to Singapore or wherever rather than pay the extra money? And then will people make the decision they don't want to take 57% of their income going to city, state, and federal taxes? Because that's what the number will be for people in the top bracket.
Jim, do you agree?
It's not going to make it easier to attract high-income people to New York. I think a lot of what makes the difference, though, in being able to attract people is the opportunity at the end of the day. And I think New York City hopefully will not be devastated by this tax cut, followed by the second act of the budget cuts. And one of the ways that we can moderate the budget cuts, should they come, and I expect that they will come, and that they'll be bad, they'll be targeted in the same way that Republicans have always wanted to shrink government to the point where they can drown it in the bathtub. So they're going to go after the entire safety net. That's going to be a problem for New York for a lot of reasons. And I think while it's true that overall, when you take away the state and local tax deduction, that leaves a lot of New Yorkers in the upper middle class and among the well-to-do who will end up paying more taxes. There are certain industries and recipients of certain types of income, like pass-through income, that will benefit very tremendously from this. So the economy of New York City in recent years has been doing so well, and we have a pretty good tax structure, that our revenues have been growing very well. And I haven't talked about the need for new revenues in a long time. But should we see devastating budget cuts, rather than let that happen, I think we have to entertain the thought of having a temporary income tax increase to recapture some of the windfall benefit that goes to those people.
How are
in
you,
New
wait,
York.
I want to have Martha and maybe Preston
So-
weigh in on how you could possibly,
All right.
given the fact that single people making more than $500,000 and those making more than $1 million are paying more, how can you target those
right.
people?
So let me explain, right? So one of the categories where New York will really benefit is for recipients of pass-through income. So we could tax pass-through income. In fact, New York State used to have an unincorporated business tax. New York City does have an unincorporated business tax. And we give people who pay that tax a credit on their income tax. That's a pretty costly tax credit. $125 million goes to millionaires in New York City as a credit on their personal income tax that they paid in New York City for unincorporated business taxes. If we just said the state would have to do this, the city can't do it on its own, we're going to put that, we're going to waive that tax credit for as long as these dramatic federal budget cuts are in place. And we should also think about having the state have a temporary unincorporated business tax income to target recipients of pass-through income.
Those are small businesses. Everyone loves them.
Well, all right, so we have a threshold, we'll have a high threshold of, as long as your income is over $1 million and you have pass-through income, we're going to tax that pass-through income at a certain rate. We're not going to tax anybody below a certain rate.
Preston?
I mean, this raises some interesting questions also about how the state and the city are going to respond in their own tax codes to these changes. So, for example, is the city going to essentially couple to the state, the federal definitions of income and treatment of income in the UBT and on the personal income tax side? So you could decouple and fully tax both at the PIT and the UBT side business pass-through income that's treated more favorably at the federal level now. So these are, and you have short-term and long-term issues, right? You have a short-term budget issue because we have a $4.4 billion problem at the state coming up. and as you say, some unknown level of cuts potentially from the federal government. And then you have the long-term sort of competitiveness issue. And I think that's, people are skeptical about temporary tax hikes because they tend to be more long-lived than they originally.
There's no such thing.
Well, there was Safe Street, Safe City, went away eventually, but it lasted a lot longer than it was originally envisioned. And I do think that there are real competitiveness issues that we have to think about there. But I think a lot of and this is going to be very hard to figure out because understanding all the interactions is extremely complex. But how the state and the city are going to treat income and whether they're going to treat it the same or differently from the federal government is going to be a big issue that they're both going to have to grapple with very quickly.
Martha, you know a lot about this stuff.
I'm always sort of interested in we are concerned about double taxation for SALT, right? It's sort of we should be able to deduct state and local taxes, and the issue on the pass-through entities is that part of the reason why people have complained about it is that it is a double tax, right? You pay it at the individual level as well, and so I think that what Jim is hitting on is the city is going to have to think about what are we going to do if there are these draconian cuts. And I'm not sure whether or not going back to the unincorporated business tax is the way, because it does result in some double taxation of people at that sort of end. So I think that I just think that, again, what's important about this is that we start trying to articulate what are the important policy considerations, and that if we want to adopt a best tax strategy for the state and the city, that we abide by the policies that we are so sort of upset about vis-a-vis the federal government. So we want to make sure that it really is a progressive income tax, and how do we make it as progressive as possible? To the extent that there are cuts, we want to make sure that those cuts are distributed in ways that are fair.
Kathy?
I just want to make the point that there's two issues here. One is New York City, one is New York State. Right. And the problem that we have in New York City, and the reason I would resist New York City coming forward with suggestions about how to put further taxes on their high earners, is that the high earner taxes all come from New York City, Long Island, Westchester. It's a downstate tax that subsidizes the whole rest of the state. So please, let's make it their problem to figure out, to begin to start figuring out how they're going to take their fair share, because New York City and the downstate area, and many of the people in Long Island and Westchester earn their living in New York City and then go out there, we're already carrying the state.
40% of New York State income taxes come from the top 1%. 75% of New York City's income tax comes from the top 10%.
But the other point is that of the millionaire's tax, the surcharge that exists, 92% comes from New York City, Westchester, and Long Island. We are carrying the state on a tax basis, and we should be very careful at looking at what our assets are here for our economy and where they're disappearing to.
You without me getting to this question, you all raised an issue that is at the bottom of my list that I wanted to wrap up this part of the conversation about. What should we do now? What should we do to pick up the pieces, to react, to plan, whatever? Preston, you want to go first?
Well, I'm leaving on Friday for vacation for a few days. That's my
Where are you going?
a low tax state.
Low tax state.
Yeah, I mean, there's this tax policy stuff at the city and state level is going to become urgent, and it's difficult. And as Kathy said, the dynamic between the state and the city is not generally to go hand in hand, kumbaya, towards
especially lately
towards a win-win. So if whether or not the city were to step forward and raise taxes locally, I'm pretty sure that the state, as Kathy said, knows exactly where to raise taxes to get the most money. The budget cut, there was a little bit of good news that I heard today. I can't confirm that it's true, but so apparently the president's going to wait to sign the tax bill until January 18th, because if you signed it prior to that, the sequestration cuts, the automatic budget cuts, would have been triggered 15 days after Congress adjourns tomorrow or Friday. If you wait till January 18th or later, it's 15 days after the next Congress adjourns. So it's push it out a year, essentially. So we may have bought ourselves, and Congress may have bought itself a year, to figure out how they're going to screw us on the budget, on the federal budget, but at least it won't be sort of automatic budget cuts where you would have had $25 billion cuts to Medicare and all kinds of other things.
That could be a very important year.
Yeah, I mean, there's no rest for the wicked here, apparently. So.
Martha?
So I think that the state should start considering offering a local tax deduction against state income taxes. I think that's sort of, I know that's a crazy idea.
Perfect.
Right, but I think something kind of along those lines. And again, I just want to say
Do
the
they
other.
not now?
No, there is no local tax deduction against
Double
state
taxation.
taxes. Absolutely. And then the other thing I was going to say, this bill, this current law does eliminate the marriage penalty to some extent on the, at least on the tax rates, and I think that that's actually not a sort of a bad thing. I just wanted to
Mark?
say that.
Yeah. So I think the effort has to be on the budget side. That would be great if we got one more year here. There's so many implications even on the housing, the budget for housing. I was talking about the big things, which are the tax credits, but there's home funds, there's CDBG, there's vouchers, all sorts of things could be affected by the discretionary budget. So I think fighting on that is really what we need to do at this point.
Everybody knows, just as long as everybody knows, when people talk about the discretionary budget, you should think of the federal budget in 3 buckets. There's what we spend on defense, what we spend on entitlements, Social Security, Medicare and Medicaid, and everything else is the discretionary budget, which is much less than 1/3 of the total spending. Paul Krugman likes to refer to the federal government as an insurance company with an army, and that sort of describes the federal budget. Jim, do you have anything to add to the way you started this?
So I actually think that when the Public Advocate said that this was the most dramatic change in 30 years, that was a dramatic understatement. This is the most dramatic federal change since the Great Depression, probably. This is really far-reaching. I think everybody in this room, everybody in New York should treat this as a temporary action by a Congress that had lost its wits. And as soon as we have a new Congress elected, this tax bill and the budget cuts that go along with it will be overturned.
Kathy?
I think I'm going to say the opposite, that we should not treat this, this was a political action, and there's everything wrong with that. As we in New York think about how we're going to deal with this and how we're going to create, we've got immigration issues, we've got crises on many fronts. I think we have to make sure we don't stick with the ideological partisan politics here in New York. We've got to think about how we're going to take care of this ourselves, because I don't think we can count on Washington to do much for us. And to do that, we're all going to have to work together, whether we're Republicans, Democrats, or what. There aren't too many Republicans in New York, but we're all going to have to work together, and we're all going to have to deal with the facts and try and get the best possible system. We've got a crisis of immigration. We've got a crisis with the transit systems, mass transit. We're going to have a series of budget crises resulting from this, and we've got challenges all over the place. So I think that it's to stay away from the politics, the partisan politics here in the city is important.
You want to take this as a moment to depart?
I'm going to take this as a moment to depart.
Kathy's off to her vacation.
Thank you.
I reviewed I just want to say one thing. I reviewed a lot of the questions, and we don't have any tax attorneys on the panel. So I'm not sure that many of the questions that you asked we can answer about this, but I'll start with one I've got here for Jim. If most taxpayers cannot deduct state and local taxes and use the standard deduction, and that standard deduction, of course, is going up, Do you think that's going to affect charitable giving and action to nonprofits? And also, if people's tax rates are down, there's less of an incentive. So is that a concern of yours?
Well, it's something to be monitored. I think in the end that, because I expect the worst in terms of budget cuts, that philanthropic-minded New Yorkers will see that and know that they have to contribute to help nonprofits stay afloat and provide the services that the federal government in all its wisdom has decided to cease providing after 6 decades.
I don't know, I'll try this with method. Will high earners employed in New York City who live out of state, Pennsylvania, be less affected by the bill? No, they have to pay New York State, they have to pay New York State tax, right, Martha?
Yeah, they have to pay as non-residents anyway, so. Somebody
asked this question of how this bill will affect small businesses and entrepreneurship. Anybody want to tackle that? Kathy made some reference to it, but anybody else want to tackle that? Preston?
So I guess my view, I mean, in theory, the idea behind, business tax cuts, whether it's on corporate tax level or the level of pass-through business income, is that you will, cause people to go out and make productive investments and grow the economy. So, we're almost at full employment right now, and people can, there's a lot of debate right now about whether or not the Fed should be raising interest rates, but there doesn't appear to be that much debate within the Fed about the question. They're raising interest rates because they think we're close to full employment. And so that's fact one. Fact two is corporate profits are at the highest level they've been at since the 1960s. And
corporate profits, but for large companies, larger companies, right?
Corporate profits, right. Corporations, C corporations. And I don't see that much productive investment going on that corresponds to that amount of money. Now, maybe when some of that $2.5 trillion that's parked overseas is repatriated, maybe people will do something with that money, or maybe they'll do more mergers and acquisitions and stock buybacks, which seems to have been the primary activity so far. So I'm skeptical about sort of how much incentive this actually gives. And I think that's what troubles me most about the bill, is that it's a huge tax giveaway with probably very little impact. You do tax stimulus when you need stimulus. We don't need stimulus right now. We needed a restructuring to make our tax code more rational. This is not it.
I did note on one of the things about the large, I got a note saying the enormous number of unemployed and underemployed in the city. I would just note that earlier this year, the New York City unemployment rate dipped to its lowest level ever at 4.0%. We've ticked up a little bit since then, but probably because more people are entering the workforce. People who had been what we call discouraged workers are back looking for work. From an employment perspective, there has never been, in my 30 years in New York, a better time. Jim,
Can I just point out, so we can talk about, and I agree with everything Preston said here about what impact it's going to have on the business community and the growth of the economy. It's still important to realize New York, small business people who make a decent amount of money are going to be relatively hurt. And a retailer can't locate someplace else, but a scientist can, researchers, there are all sorts of people who have an alternative. And that question about being taxed in New York State is, you're taxed by what % of your income is from New York State. So, and that can also be changed. So there are lots of ways where our relative burden here matters, even if overall, by some miracle, that it actually helps the national economy.
Jim?
So on the corporate tax cut side, so the corporate tax cuts will clearly benefit shareholders who own the stocks of U.S. companies. So if 35% of the stocks on the stock market are owned by foreigners, that means that the president and the Republican leaders have just given a $50 billion tax break to foreign investors. That's more than the bottom 60% of Americans will receive. So they have their priorities right, I guess.
If you really want to know a lot about this, and you really want to know about the difference between GDP and GNP, and it's called, Krugman calls it the leprechaun economy because it's about Ireland. He's written some wonderful pieces lately on it. Jim, I'm going to stay with you because someone said, you brought this up a couple times. Why don't you define sequestered for people?
I didn't bring that up.
No.
Preston brought it.
I brought that up.
All right, Preston, you get to define
So under the-
sequestration, but then Jim gets to answer the question about how this thing might affect Medicare.
All right, so sequestration should not be confused with desequestration, which is not. Sequestration arises from the 2011 Pay-As-You-Go Act, which basically says that any time the deficit is increased, you have to, over a 10-year period, you have to automatically offset that with revenues or spending cuts. So the tax bill will increase the deficit, and so it has to be offset by spending cuts. They will automatically take effect unless Congress waives the rule, essentially, which would require under the rules, and don't ask me to explain this, but under the rules, cannot be done under reconciliation rules. It has to have bipartisan agreement, can't be just done on a 51 vote basis in the Senate. So that requires Democrats to go along. Now the Democrats are in a box because presumably they're not going to cut the budget to make a political point. And now we have some time apparently to fight even more over this, which I'm delighted to hear. So that's what sequestration is, sort of automatic budget cuts under the pay-as-you-go rules.
Jim, what about your views about whether this will matter for Medicare?
Well, so there was the chance of an automatic cut in Medicare as part of sequestration. So at least for the time being, we're past that. But again, given the congressional budget resolution that says we're going to cut until there's nothing left to cut, it's only a matter of time before Medicare and Social Security are targets for that cutting. But that will come after food stamps and Medicaid. The buzzword that the president and the chair of the House Ways and Means Committee, Kevin Brady, and others have been using is after we do tax reform, we're going to do welfare reform. I mean, you thought welfare reform had been done 20 years ago in 1996. Well, they mean by welfare reform, we're going to cut the social safety net in this country. Everything from unemployment insurance to food stamps to Medicaid to TANF to, they're going to try and roll back EITC at some point, probably. And
It's
caught
the
up
Earned
in
Income
that.
Tax Credit, which refunds money to people who work, basically to give them back the Social Security taxes that they pay for people making $15,000, $20,000.
So they will eventually get to Medicare and Social Security, which I would describe, it's not wrong to call them entitlements, but I think more properly, they're social insurance. These are programs that everybody pays into, and you're, it's social insurance that you're entitled to, but it's not an entitlement in the sense that everybody gets it just by virtue of citizenship or some other broad category. You're a member of you're a contributor to the social insurance program, just like unemployment insurance and workers' comp, where the employer is paying that. But Social Security and Medicare, people have paid into.
It's an entitlement
It can't
because,
be cut.
but it's an entitlement because the money is not appropriated. It goes out as needed, and it's entitlement because when you turn 65, you get Medicare.
Yeah, that's only
and
a
when you
budget
turn
category,
62, you can get Social Security, and when you're poor enough in the state, you qualify for Medicaid. Martha, I've got a question for you. Someone's really paying attention out there because I only vaguely heard about this yesterday, that there are ideas floating around to deal with salt. The note says in California, I didn't know that specifically. But one idea that's floating around is that we would change income taxes to payroll taxes, and companies would then be able to deduct them, or the money from the paycheck would be called a payroll tax. Or the other idea I heard the other day is that the state, instead of having income taxes, would have people make charitable deductions in lieu of that, and the charitable deductions would be deductible. What should we think of this?
So it's interesting when you mention payroll taxes, because they are certainly the highest tax that most of us pay, is the amount that's taken out for from our payroll for various things. So I like the idea of converting maybe some of the income tax to payroll taxes. I did want to also say about charitable deductions. I think that's a really interesting sort of concern. I was going to actually ask if I could say something about that. I think depending on where you are, whether or not you itemize or you don't, it might make more sense for you to do more charitable deductions. So if you're actually in the itemized category, since charitable deductions are allowed to be deducted, I think the not-for-profit community might want to start advertising that to some of their high-income taxpayers whose SALT deduction is limited to $10,000, to start saying, well, if you give charitable deductions, you won't lose as much of the deductibility on your federal income taxes. But the payroll tax idea is a pretty creative one. I read something about that as well, and so it's certainly something for us to think about.
There were a series of questions on here about the medical deductions. They are preserved.
They actually lowered. I thought they lowered.
Oh, they yes, they're even better, right?
Yeah,
It's
so
easier to
it's
claim.
seven only for 2 years, but it's now back down to over 7.5% rather than 10%. So,
Anybody want to tackle the impact on the Affordable Care Act? I could say a couple things about it.
Well, so the bill eliminates the personal insurance requirement. I guess the forecasts were, from a few weeks back, that would result in 13 million people losing their health insurance coverage directly, and premium costs rising for millions of others.
Losing's an interesting word there, though, because they're not losing it, they're deciding not to opt for it. It's very important to listen to everyone about how they use their words. The losing is a choice that they're making. It may not be a good choice, but it's a choice.
but it's a public health issue.
No, there are two parts to it. There are two parts to it. The 13 million people are people who now are getting insurance under the Affordable Care Act because they have to do that or pay an increasingly significant tax. The 13 million are people who will decide not to get insurance on their own because they don't want to pay and they won't have to pay the tax. Now, in addition to that, some people will be priced out because it is believed that those 13 million people are probably healthier, and there are a second group being priced out. But I think I'm objecting to Jim's use of the word losing in that regard.
You should just clarify why you're doing it. There's a group that gets subsidy. The increase in premium, they'll still get the subsidy.
Right.
So you really
As a
talk
matter
about
of fact, the
people-
Republicans in Congress in the next week or two are going to say they're going to move a bill which is going to restore the subsidies that Trump has been threatening to kill, dragging his feet on, etc.
It's just complicated as to people who buy in the exchange and get the subsidy. Those who are buying in the exchange didn't get the subsidy. Those are people who are probably going to have the biggest increases, and they will likely opt out. So.
I want to give, we're just about out of time, and I've done most of the questions that this panel can ask. I think I'll go down the panel, and we'll start with Jim. One final comment for the people in the room, and then I'll call Gale back.
So I think people should give serious consideration to supporting a temporary pass-through tax in New York State, so long as federal budget cuts really harm vulnerable New Yorkers.
Mark?
That's hard to follow. So,
And very controversial.
and
by
very
the way.
controversial. You know, as an urban economist, I do very much worry about our long-term competitiveness, and I'll just say that. So, whether we can afford to even make a bigger differential between taxes here and what people pay elsewhere, and whether that will have an impact on our economy. I think the short run, the very short run, is about budget, the federal budget, and spending money on all of the things that Jim outlined, and a whole host of things that I can talk about in terms of the affordable housing and vouchers and home floods and those things. The intermediate is really, as Kathy said, this is a political fight, and I think we need to be fully engaged in that.
Martha?
I want to ditto the political fight part of it and be engaged. But Jim, I think, wrote an article several weeks ago, maybe a couple of months ago, wherein he looked at the progressivity of the state tax structure and the city's tax structure. And in it, he sort of suggested that actually the state's tax is more progressive. And I think that because all of these changes are going on, the cities, it's incumbent on the city and the state to make sure they have the best tax structure possible, one that is both progressive, that does not discourage people or maybe lead to people leaving the state and the city, and that we should get our tax structure house in order, because we're going to have to rely on it likely in the future.
Preston?
I guess I'd make sort of the budget parallel argument and agree with the now absent Kathy Wild that we can't afford to wait. We really have to treat this as sort of a, at least for now, permanent, if that makes sense.
Well, it does make sense, because even if the Democrats won the Congress in 2018, President Trump or even a President Pence would not allow this bill to be overturned, I think.
Right. So we will, I think as a city and a state, we need to sort of get a grasp on what we think the future landscape looks like and start to take action to prepare for it.
I've been working on a big tech story for Cranes about the tech sector in New York, our second most important industry these days. And the one good news about that is that none of this matters to them, because Silicon Valley is just as expensive and maybe more expensive than New York on real estate, on talent, on everywhere, and on taxes. So they will continue to grow here.
Except there was an article in the paper today, Greg, stating that they're all going to go to Montreal.
They're not all going to go to Montreal. None of the people I've talked to are going to Montreal.
It's too cold there.
Manhattan Borough President, the floor is yours.
I have one more question. If you could start in with Preston, just to outline a little bit more, because you talked about for the just the next scenario. Because if you talk about the 18th of January, what happens? And just going down the road here, what happens next? What happens in the Jim talked about the next year. I guess that'd be 2020 in terms of any impact on all of our Medicaid, Medicare, and so on. But just to give the public a little bit more of a scenario on what's next, time-wise, from your perspective. Go ahead, Greg.
Well, if I didn't know about that, he's not going to sign the bill till January 18th. But if he doesn't do that, it means basically that there'll be fights over the budget in the coming year. But they'll need more than 50 votes, right? They'll need the 60 votes in the Senate. So it'll be very unlikely that the Republicans can push through these cuts in the next year. And so that means that this will be an issue that follows the 2018 election. Yes. And that we're not fighting about it, but the efforts to make big changes will have to come in 2018. Mark?
I just want to point out the withholding tax is the first thing people will see.
And you will
they
see
are ready to change that. So they're going to be pointing to the decrease in taxes, and depending on how they set the withholding tax, they don't really care to be a little on the low side, because the people no one will realize whether they then have to owe taxes at the end of the year until the election.
Yes, those of you who are getting
over.
paychecks, they're going to go up in February or March at the latest.
And then the other question then for Preston is what happens in terms of our local considerations, if anything? Because obviously we have a state budget and then a city budget.
So again, I mean, I think, there's people, yeah, leaving on vacation. There's a lot of people who are not leaving on vacation, I would guess, because they're the tax administrators and people have to figure out what we're going to do about our tax laws. And, I'm glad I'm not the budget director right now. That's all I can say. On the spending front, and I mean, the Comptroller has been saying for a while now that, and we said it a little bit more emphatically recently, we really need to we've added a lot of spending to the city's budget, and we have not really looked at how effective it is, how efficient it is. We haven't asked agencies to go through the exercise of really scrubbing their budgets carefully for efficiencies. It's becoming imperative that we sort of prepare on the spending side also to get our house in order. And the state budget is not going to be kind to us. So that's another reason.
The city budget in the first de Blasio term went up 18%, almost 3 times the rate of inflation.
Martha, do you have any other suggestions about even ACA? That seems to be what people are most concerned about because we think we beat it and now it's back again in terms of issues.
So in terms of the Affordable Care Act and what's going on there, I mean, I think the points that were made is that we have to be mindful that people who are teetering on the edge in terms of insurance are likely to opt out of insurance because now there's no longer to be a penalty associated with not having insurance. And I think we have to be sort of mindful about that. I mean, Greg made the point of they are making a choice, but in many instances they're not making a choice because the finances are forcing them to sort of think about that. And it's a public health issue to be addressed.
Mark, you mentioned something about the state might have to help us out on affordable housing, but they don't help us out too much. So how will that work?
Yeah, in order to carry out the plan, it's going to require more money than is now in the budget. And where that's going to come from, I have no idea.
Okay. And then, Jim, I guess question again about how you think this is going to seriously impact or not low-income New Yorkers now or in the future.
So, again, I'm most concerned about what might happen on the budget front. I mean, it does look like the Republicans are hell-bent on dramatic federal budget cuts. Keep in mind that New York State's budget gets 1/3 of its funding from the federal government. New York City budget gets 10%. However, the Health and Hospitals Corporation gets half of its budget from the federal government, and the Housing Authority gets 90% of its non-rental income from the federal government. So what happens at the federal budget in precisely the areas that are most vulnerable in terms of safety net spending on human services, housing, education, Medicaid, those are the things that are most likely to get trimmed or slashed at the federal level. Those are the things that New York City and state heavily rely on. So that's going to affect the budgets, which in turn will affect low-income people. And of course, low-income people receive food stamps directly, so they're going to be affected by that. And we've already seen a reduction. Recall that during, as part of the American Recovery Act in 2008, there was a temporary increase in the value of food stamps. That went away a couple of years ago. So we're already enduring much less in the way of the food stamp benefits than what we had a few years ago. And the Republicans seem to be very determined to cut that further. So I expect that that will put pressure on the city and the state budgets, which are already under a lot of pressure, to how do they respond to dramatic reduction in food stamps.
You want to mention CHIP?
So CHIP, I guess, so the Child Health Insurance Program, which expired at the end of September, benefits 9 million kids around the country, I guess 740,000 something in New York State, about half that in New York City. The Republicans were so busy cutting taxes that they didn't get around to renewing the authority for CHIP. It looks like the Democrats have made it just unavoidable that they'll have to act on that before long. I've lost track of what the timing is on when they might do this, but it looks like it should get reauthorized soon. Hopefully that will happen.
I want to thank our moderator and the panel. Thank you very much, audience.